between his current belief system and the teachings of the Course. Maybe you find yourself in that story, or maybe that's just a story about a turtle. It's up for you to decide whether or not to give it meaning. So we are going to be reading today in chapter 4, having to do with the ego and its false sense of autonomy, which we introduced this concept in the chapter 3, where we talked about the authority problem. And then we're going to delve into that from another angle today. Before we do that, however, I wanted to go back one paragraph into section 1, the conclusion of section 1, and read again that last paragraph, for I feel so profoundly moved by it. And I just wanted to make sure everybody can recall what was said there. So hello and welcome to Miracles on High Plains. My name is Jonica, and our reader for this session is Atisha B.
I will substitute for your ego if you wish, but never for your spirit. A father can safely leave a child with an elder brother who has shown himself responsible, but this involves no confusion about the child's origin. The brother can protect the child's body and his ego, but he does not confuse himself with the father because he does this. I can be entrusted with your body and your ego only because this enables you not to be concerned with them and lets me teach you their unimportance. I could not understand their importance to you if I had not once been tempted to believe in them myself. Let us undertake to learn this lesson together so we can be free of them together. I need devoted teachers who share my aim of healing the mind. Spirit is far beyond the need of your protection or mine. Remember this. In this world, you need not have tribulation because I have overcome the world. That is why you should be of good cheer.
So the question we often find ourselves asking in the Course of Miracles as we become aware of the ego we have made is what to do with our ego, especially as we withdraw belief in it and divest power from it. And here Christ says he will substitute for your ego if you wish, and that he can be entrusted with both your body and your ego, that he can protect your body, and that frees you from being overly occupied with your ego and with your body. It enables you not to be concerned with them and put them in their proper order as temporary devices. The ego and the body are both temporary teaching devices. And once you learn the lesson, you no longer need those teaching devices and you discard them. And so, and Christ can do this because he went through this experience himself. And so we're invited to undertake this lesson together so that we can be free of the body's identification and ego identification, become free of them together. And then that freedom allows us to fulfill the lofty function which God has given us is to be extenders, to be messengers, to be teachers, in quotes, of a set of principles, the laws of heaven and the laws of healing and forgiveness. And that is the purpose of the course, is to free us and to be able to bring about the good cheer that comes naturally as a result of being free of fear of the body, fear of the ego. So that was the last paragraph in the prior section. Now we'll move on to today's section.
It is reasonable to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. In fact, it is the best question you could ask. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past because the past does not matter. And history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. Abstract thought applies to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal, and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Perception, however, is always specific and therefore quite concrete.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the most frequently asked questions of students in the Course of Miracles is how the ego began. And he affirms that it's quite reasonable and perhaps the best question you could ask. And what people imply by the question is how it began long, long ago. At perhaps the beginning of the human race or the beginning of time or in ancient times, how it began back then. And that is approach of looking to the past is there's no point in giving an answer that has to do with some ancient time when the mistake of identifying with the ego is being made in the present. Our focus should be on recognizing the mistake we make in the present, and so that we can become free in the present. And that's far more valuable than some kind of historical narrative of thousands of years ago that would, so to speak, point the finger elsewhere. And so it doesn't matter that historical account wouldn't have any meaning at all if we were completely free of the ego now. The fact that we're not is the reason why this becomes a question that occurs to the mind. So now there's a transition here in thought. So you have to make a leap here. And let's take it in steps. Using the method of approach called perception, perception always looks for a very specific, concrete instance. For an example of this in terms of the ego, might be looking at how one particular person operates according to the ego. It's very specific, it's very concrete. That's the way perception approaches all things. It looks for a specific example. You could say it narrows its view to one instance, which would be fragmenting it from all other instances and over indexes on the one specific example. That has consequences. In contrast to perception, the type of knowledge that is shared in God's mind, in heaven, and from all those who have totally learned to forgive is called abstract thought. It is a universal and eternal, based on universal and eternal principles, which apply to everywhere and everyone forever. An abstract thought is timeless and spaceless and transcendent of all instances. It's completely impersonal. It's not about you or your neighbor. It's about the principle that applies to us all. And so, no judgment, one of the consequences of this, no judgment is involved in the recognition of an abstract thought because you're not tagging any one individual as being judged or guilty of that thought. It's a recognition that it's true for everyone. So I am as God created me, I am his son eternally, is true of everyone, everywhere. There's no judgment involved. It's merely a remembrance or a recognition of an eternal truth. Whereas perception narrows its focus, tends to think of whatever it's looking at. Let's say it's another person who's doing something you don't particularly care for, narrows its focus there and makes some kind of judgment and believes that the thought, that the judgment that's in your own mind is really true of the other person, but not true of you. Very different type of, I'm letting somebody in, very different type of perceptual system there. So why is this, why do we do this? Why bring this up? Because we're going to notice that the ego's thought system operates according to a set, a pattern of thought, which is entirely different from the one that God created us in and for and with. God created us in a universal, eternal harmony that's applicable throughout the past, the present, and the future to all living beings.
Everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, which is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. He also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process that alters both because they were not made by or with the unalterable. It is important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical interaction. Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction. There could be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact.
Mm-hmm. So we are looking at what could be thought of as ego dynamics. How do the dynamics of the ego work in both your own life as well as in the lives of others and the interactions? And so we've said before in the previous chapter of self versus self-creating is that everyone assembles together a set of beliefs about yourself into a self-image, which we call the ego. It's something that is made independent of spirit guidance. It's something that we piece together on our own, and it's subject to enormous variation as well as instability. For in other words, it's a work in progress. And in fact, your ego is still something that is a work in progress. It's not fixed forever. What you might not have realized is that you also apply that same skill of making an ego to everyone else that you encounter. You assemble together in your own mind a set of attributes that you sense, perceive from the other person, and piece them together into some kind of formulation of how you perceive that individual. It's not a complete picture. It may be based on a very limited amount of information, but it becomes your starting point, your working point. We often find that we're completely wrong about those initial perceptions when we get to know a person. And so then those two individuals, each with both their own ego concept as well as an ego concept of the other, interact with each other. Remember, we said these ego concepts are unstable. They interact with each other, and that process alters the self concept of both because of the source is unstable. And yes, and then it goes on to say, and this can even happen when the person's not in your own physical space. You can even have an altered concept of another person even when you're thinking about them. It's that subject to change. So, having walked all the way through that, here's the bigger point is the ego is nothing more than an idea assembled in the mind. This is very important for all miracle students to understand. The ego is not a being. It's not a true creation of the creator. It's not a psychic energy or a Jungian archetype or some kind of demigod with power of its own. It's merely an assemblage of ideas. And you, as you know, those ideas only have meaning if you give it to them. And if you give those ideas no meaning whatsoever, then the true meaninglessness of the ego is then seen for sure. This relates, by the way, to something that we read in the previous chapter around the authority. It's in a situation and a set of interactions between two ego identified persons is a situation in which each other are literally projecting your judgments, your perceptions upon each other, literally fighting you and the other person to become the one who is authoring the self concept. And that is said to be a fundamental error. So, that's probably enough for ego dynamics to get a feel for how fragile, unstable, and for their source. And so when you see it through this lens, freeing yourself of the ego is natural when guided by the Holy Spirit. It's natural to want to free oneself of these fundamental errors regarding your own nature.
Your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego was made. When you threw knowledge away, it is as if you never had it. This is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. If this occurs in the present, why is it surprising that it occurred in the past? Surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, though hardly to something that occurs with such persistence. But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now.
So, in the larger system outlined in A Course in Miracles, when we were created by the Creator, so to speak, we are all surrounding the bright light of the Creator. We were in a state of perfect understanding, perfect knowledge. Our minds were one mind. We knew all that was to be known. This is an idealized state before we ever were born in the bodies, before time and space began. We had knowledge, perfect knowledge of the oneness. And so, in the storyline of time and space, we threw knowledge away and started behaving as if we never had it. Well, they're making an analysis here for the present moment when we identify with our ego. It's an experience of throwing knowledge away as if we never had it. This occurs in the present. And so it should be no surprise that it has also occurred in the past. And it continues, and with that error, that fundamental error of believing in perceptions generated out of your lower mind, ego perceptions, instead of the recognition of your true holy self. My mind is part of God's, I'm very holy. That dialectic between two opposite poles will continue to occur until we fully recognize the consequences of toying around with the ego and finally make the great decision to jettison it, to relinquish it for good, to no longer believe in it, no longer to give our power of our mind to it.
Think of the love of animals for their offspring and the need they feel to protect them. That is because they regard them as part of themselves. No one dismisses something he considers part of himself. You react to your ego much as God does to his creations, with love, protection, and charity. Your reactions to the self you made are not surprising. In fact, they resemble in many ways how you will one day react to your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. The question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. Belief is an ego function, and as long as your origin is open to belief, you are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. When teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know God. Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self.
So there's a couple ideas here that we can examine. And one should we should do right from the beginning. It says that the ego is something that we have made. We have formulated a concept of ourself on our own. The consequence of making a self concept, an ego image of ourselves, is that we believe it and that we cherish it as being meaningful, as being useful, and so that we react to it as if it was our true self. This is believing it. We consider it part of ourself. This is the fundamental error in self identification. We wind up thinking the ego is part of us rather than the inner light of the eternal creator being part of us. And so this is, I think the entire course hinges around this matter right here. The question is not how the ways in which you respond to the ego, but the big question is what you believe you are. I am a child of God. My mind is very holy, is the truth. And so that is the central foundation and fundamental matter that must be corrected. And one can do that. The workbook lessons are the manual for mind training to do that. Trust me, if you practice it enough, it will become second nature to you. And then whenever your mind defaults back towards responding to the ego as if it were you, part of you will know that this could not be true. Part of you will question that old idea of you being the ego. And so then we get into the second, more abstract idea found in this paragraph, which is the role of beliefs in your spiritual journey. And it turns out that in heaven, there are no beliefs in heaven, for there is perfect knowledge. Said another way, when you in heaven, quote, in heaven, when we know the mind of God, there is no reason to cobble together a bunch of theories, a bunch of hypotheses that says, well, I believe this, someone else believes that. Beliefs are a lower level activity not found in heaven, but beliefs can, since they are fundamental to perception, they can also be utilized to free us from a state of merely believing in something. So belief that there's another way of perceiving yourself and the world is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. It's a hint of recognition that the ego's way of perceiving and the ego's identity is not the self. So we would say that there's a three-step process here. I could have outlined this on a separate slide, but you just have to follow the words here. From the first stage would be a stage of unbelief or a belief in the big lie. That would be the total ego dominated stage. Second stage questions all the beliefs of the first stage and substitutes a new set of beliefs that are more in accord with the Holy Spirit's teachings. When you practice the workbook lessons, you are asserting a new set of beliefs that are contrary to the ego beliefs. So that's the second stage. It's a better, more hopeful set of beliefs. But that's still an intermediate stage, stage two. Real freedom comes in stage three, which is beyond beliefs. It's into the realm of knowing. It's into that stage of consciousness that no longer is learning from trial and error, but has true access to the mind of the Creator, to know the thoughts of God. Paul?
Um, John, I don't know whether this is the right time to ask this question or not, but um, it seems from my experience that the more that I see myself as a child of God and accept myself as a child of God, that I can do that with other people that I don't know, as opposed to, and it's so hard because I so quickly go to making those judgments and based on perception and um, I mean, it's just so natural, so customary for me to do it that way. But I think that when I really think about it, and um, it seems like I get a little different perspective when I try to see it from them as being a child of God, as opposed to some of the attributes or the way they dress, the way they look, or whatever.
Right. Yes. That's a natural extension of this, the mind training here is that others become a mirror of yourself. So we start to see ourselves in a new light and start to see others in that same light. And this, Paul, goes all the way up to the higher state of walking in the light of grace, where you, where we adopt the vision of Christ as our own and see ourselves as being a part of Christ's mission, and also by extension, see everyone else as a part of Christ's mission. And so this is really a healthy sign, Paul, that you're seeing other people in a new light.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Okay, we'll go on.
Undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though this is anything but true. Babies scream in rage if you take away a knife or scissors, although they may well harm themselves if you do not. In this sense, you are still a baby. You have no sense of real self-preservation and are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you most. Yet, whether or not you recognize it now, you have agreed to cooperate in the effort to become both harmless and helpful, attributes that go together. Your attitudes, even toward this, are necessarily conflicted because all attitudes are ego-based. This will not last. Be patient a while and remember that the outcome is as certain as God.
So the subject for this is the ego's thought system and learning to gradually free oneself from that investment. We talked about in previous session about we've made a big investment in the ego's thought system, and this is a program of divesting from your faith from the ego's thought system and reinvesting into the Holy Spirit's teaching system. So one of the ways in which our human minds structure our set of beliefs are in the form of attitudes. And when I first realized what it's saying here, it hit me like a bomb because it's a very all-inclusive. All attitudes are ego-based. And so I want to elaborate a little bit on that. Think of an attitude as an orientation of your mind. It's a type of judgment of your mind towards some person, group of persons, some experience. I'll just randomly pick some things that come to mind. If one has an attitude that being a vegetarian is the morally higher way to go, then they have an attitude about animals and eating animals. It becomes a set of beliefs, but it becomes one in which questions are no longer asked. It's kind of the answers have already been decided upon, and then we respond to every situation. A person with a belief system responds to every situation through the lens of that attitude towards it. I don't really want to go through a lot of examples because they're specific. I'd rather speak in abstract terms, that whenever the mind forms a set of attitudes towards anything, it operates from a rigid, closed-minded point of view regarding what it believes to be true about those external things or people. And thus, it perfectly fits with the ego's defensive structure, in that it's a way of weaponizing the mind's judgment against another so that you would not even consider any other possibility. And so the lesson that is elaborated on other parts in A Course in Miracles is attitudes, in order to heal, need to gently be unstructured, uncoupled from each other. Little by little, each of the beliefs that go into forming those attitudes are called into question, and we come up with a new orientation and discard that belief, and gradually that rigid attitude dissolves into one that finally results in forgiveness, the realization that I had it all wrong in my attitude, and that I'm now, Holy Spirit has guided me to a new perception, and one that is loving, forgiving, and loving, and charitable towards the others. Just like Paul, let's see how to say it. Sometimes I've seen people develop attitudes towards neighbors who might behave in ways that are not the way a person is accustomed to, and then think of their neighbor as a undesirable or not improper individual. Well, forgiveness is about dissolving all those mental judgments, those mental structures, about no longer investing in those attitudes, and realizing that there must be another way of looking at this, a way that is forgiving and charitable and loving, a way that allows me to see the light in another soul, so that I might see the light in my own soul. Be patient and remember, the outcome is as certain as God.
Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. This is obvious when you consider what is involved. To the ego, to give anything implies that you will have to do without it. When you associate giving with sacrifice, you give only because you believe that you are somehow getting something better and can therefore do without the thing you give. Giving to get is an inescapable law of the ego, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos. It is therefore continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity that gave rise to it. Its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. Self-esteem in ego terms means nothing more than that the ego has deluded itself into accepting its reality and is therefore temporarily less predatory. This self-esteem is always vulnerable to stress, a term which refers to any perceived threat to the ego's existence.
I just remembered the little turtle without its shell. It has a perceived threat to its existence in that it has lost its defensive mechanism there. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, really. Atisha asked me a while back about these little clouds that I sometimes drop in there, and I do that for myself as a reminder of what I feel to be a really key insight or an insight that helps to unlock a broader perspective. And so that applies to this. I also bolded it there. And in some ways, this can relate to Paul's comment of a few moments ago that he was starting to see others in a more positive light, what we would call it a more charitable light in the Course. And we know from the laws of perception that you can only see another in a light when you're willing to acknowledge it, that that's what's true of yourself. And so it's in that process, that is a process of letting go of stale attitudes and questioning those beliefs, forgiving them, and making room for a new set of perceptions from the Holy Spirit. This statement here is more about the end stage. Only those who have a real and a lasting sense of abundance. This is someone who recognizes, I am a child of God. My mind is very holy. I have a function God would have me fulfill. I feel a sense of abundance. And notice we're not talking about a transitory, momentary, passing glimpse, but a real and lasting sense of abundance. That state where one views their own selfhood as walking in the light of Christ, that state, only those can be truly charitable, unquestionably blessing others without any sense that you're emptying yourself of anything. It's a sense of unlimited having unlimited light and love from the source of all creation flow through you. You have unlimited blessings to give to others. This is just the opposite of the way the ego believes. The ego believes that giving to others, giving a blessing to others, is a form of sacrifice, and that you would only give to another because somehow you believe that you're going to get something back in return. It's called the giving to get. It's a form of bargaining. I'll scratch my back only if you scratch, I'll scratch your back only if you scratch my back. It's a bargain. It's a price to be paid. But a sense of abundance is a sense of a law. We read about it yesterday in a previous session, a sense of a lofty function that viewed from the ego's eyes is absolutely incredible or not credible. It's a lofty function that is full of abundance and full of blessings, that is happy to give, that realizes your own true nature is affirmed in your giving a blessing to others. So that's what we are called to. And of course, the ego has an exact opposite. The ego has the belief in scarcity, limitation, and lack, and is very fragile.
The ego literally lives by comparisons. Equality is beyond its grasp, and charity becomes impossible. The ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. That is why the concept of getting arose in the ego's thought system. Appetites are getting mechanisms, representing the ego's need to confirm itself. This is as true of body appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Body appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home and tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind, which has become completely confused about what is really possible.
So it says the ego literally lives by comparisons. So I wanted to tell on myself as an example of something perhaps you can relate to. And it has to do with a habit that I acquired long ago and making progress on, but has to do with driving in traffic. Many Course of Miracles students have cited to me that, especially if you live in a more congested area where there's a lot of traffic and lots of sometimes crazy traffic activity, how they really get triggered by traffic. And I, for decades of my life, used to have a belief that the person behind me was impatient or didn't care for the way I was driving, particularly if they got closer. I felt like I was this is crazy. I'm not saying this is sane, but I was comparing myself to how I'm driving compared to the person behind me. And this is often the case of if they wanted to go faster than I was going. I would often feel uncomfortable about myself because I felt like I was holding up this person behind me. And so I'm not, I'm telling on myself, the ego literally lives by comparing itself to others. And there are 1,000 other ways in which that can be illustrated. I'm just sharing that one there. It's a total illusion. It's all just going on inside one's mind. It's a form of judgment that involves judging oneself in comparison to what you perceive to be true in another. Realize this is like an ego game. This is a game that egos play. And you can do it. I can do it right in my own mind. I don't need anybody else's help. I can do it all by myself. Play this game of belief that the comparisons my mind is making are meaningful or real or somehow helpful. I'm better off making them. Um, know that anytime you make comparisons about any set of attributes between yourself and another, that's an invitation to play the game of guilt. Let's make a judgment and feel bad about it, either about oneself or another. It's the game of guilt the ego plays. And then mind training is about knowing these things happen, about rigid attitudes, game of guilt, and being able to recognize the problem when it arises so that you don't continue to invest yourself in it. You don't continue to give power to it, but pay attention to how you feel, because it usually comes with, for me, a sense of tension and anxiety. Discomfort is not tranquil. It is not peaceful. It's and comes with a heightened sense of alert and defensiveness, and that should be a signal that your mind is orienting towards something that the ego would reinforce.
The ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. It is not free, however, to open the premise to question, because the premise is its foundation. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. The ego's ceaseless attempts to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are useless. Spirit, in its knowledge, is unaware of the ego. It does not attack it. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. While the ego is equally unaware of spirit, it does perceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional.
Let's deal with that last line a moment, and then we'll come back to the earlier statements. Because in pop psychology, there are whole workshops and schools and great effort in applied towards helping people with self-esteem issues. Particularly, I think young people, it becomes a big concern if a parent notices their youngster having real trouble with their self-esteem. Of course, you love them and you want to see them grow to be happy and fulfilled. But by no means is this limited to young people. This is an age. Has to do with esteeming oneself. And since the ego, this is fascinating, the ego, your lower mind, and its false identity, recognize that there's something greater than itself that is also has a part of your attention. We're talking about your soul, your higher mind. it recognizes there's something else greater than itself. And so it has a self-esteem issue there. It believes itself less than the soul. And so the idea of trying to build self-esteem into the ego is by definition impossible, because the ego already believes it's inferior to the soul. And you can't change that. It is inferior to the soul. And so trying to build up one's ego self-concept is wasted effort. It's trying to do the impossible. It is possible, however, to have and encourage a person to identify with their soul and have a soul esteem, if you will, not a little ego self-esteem, but a soul self-esteem. It is possible to do that. And that's what the Course of Miracles workbook lessons do. I am a child of God. I'm loved by the Creator. It's building your esteem as located in soul identification. All right, the other point that I've chosen to bold is what we call the premise of the ego's thought system. Its foundation of the ego's thought system is it's a belief in your mind that it is completely on its own. So I want to illustrate this by stating the obvious. This is the widely prevailing belief, the ego's premise, the foundation of its thought system, that inside your skull, where you do your thinking, that those thoughts are private, that you have them all to your own, that nobody else knows what you're thinking and feeling. Now, you can attempt to tell other people about how you're feeling or what you're thinking, but if in truth, it's the belief that your thoughts exist separate from the rest of the universe, that they're yours and yours alone. And this can lead to further psychological splitting, such that, let's say you have a person at work, I'll make it your boss, your manager, and in your own mind, you believe that they are a morally reprehensible individual, that they've done things that no good person would do. But at work, you don't interact with them as if, according to your belief, you instead interact with them according to, you play by the rules, you play nice to be acceptable so you don't get fired. And so that winds up entertaining two thought systems that are diametrically opposed. One is that I'm cooperative and I'll get along with my boss at work and follow orders and try to satisfy the requirements there. And the other is in your private thoughts that are supposedly known only to yourself, you entertain an entirely different viewpoint. This is splitting your mind across two thought systems. Well, I'm just illustrating what I think is obvious for everyone that still has some identification with the ego. It's the belief that your mind is separate from all other minds, that your mind, so to speak, is an entity unto itself without relationship to the one mind of the Creator. And so, because this is the premise of the ego, its foundation, This is the statement that the Holy Spirit works to undo and free you of. And the reason for that is once the belief that your mind is a part of God's, that it's very holy, that thoughts leave not their source, that you were created in the mind of God and remain a full-fledged member of the mind of God, then all of the ego's game playing, its game of guilt, its sense of autonomy, its sense of an independent self-concept all collapse. They become ridiculous notions when we realize that we are of one mind with the Creator. I had to split that paragraph into 2 slides.
The creations of God do not create myths, although creative effort can be turned to mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition. What it makes is then no longer creative. Myths are entirely perceptual and so ambiguous in form and characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful connotations.
The thing that I take about this is I'm really a fan of referring to widely popular beliefs that the ego has taught as mythologies. Many mythologies, many religions are based upon an assemblage of mythologies. I really like that term. It's simply a mythological set of ideas that people believe to be true. And so that renders them less frightening, less judgmental. We all have our own mythologies that we've believed in. And the Holy Spirit's endeavor is to gently work with you until you're willing to surrender your long cherished mythologies and become free and allow no thoughts to interfere between your awareness and the light of God.
Myths and magic are closely associated, since myths are usually related to ego origins and magic to the powers the ego ascribes to itself. Mythological systems generally include some account of the creation and associate this with its particular form of magic. The so-called battle for survival is only the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is usually associated with physical birth because it is hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. The more religiously ego-oriented may believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist after a temporary lapse into ego life. Some even believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse. However, salvation does not apply to spirit, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged.
Well, the comment that I have regards what is magic in the Course of Miracles. We're not talking about stage magic. in a popular sense of it. But what does Course in Miracles mean by the term magic? And it really refers to a belief, a false belief about power that the ego has to change matter, meaning it's a form of level confusion that says the ego, in its cleverness, can come up with a set of formulations and ideas which can be applied to alter matter. Much of efforts to heal the body are placed in this category: magic potions, magic formula, spells, totems, and other beliefs in magic, which are powers of the ego, which are thought to then alter the material world or the material body. And so that's not really, the magic is not really the subject of this section. It's just brought up in passing here, mainly to group it along with myths. So myths have to do with how the ego originated. Magic has to do with the power it now has. And we'll bring up magic again later in a broader context.
Salvation is nothing more than right-mindedness, which is not the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit, but which must be achieved before one-mindedness is restored. Right-mindedness leads to the next step automatically, because right perception is uniformly without attack, and therefore wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. Its direction is always automatic because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres.
So this is very obvious illustration of the three-stage process in the Course of Miracles that begins with wrong-mindedness, that moves to right-mindedness, and that culminates in one-mindedness. The key to it all is escaping from wrong-mindedness and entering into right-mindedness. That's the most important step. That is the goal of this course, is to move into right-mindedness. And it says that wrong-mindedness becomes obliterated. How? Because obliterated, the ego can't survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. We could say that another way. Your and my belief that we are egos cannot continue if we were to enter into total forgiveness, which is free of judgment. There would be no attack, no labeling, no attitudes, no sense of scarcity. It would be free, truly free. And that brings about the obliteration of the ego, because there's no power going to mental power, no faith given to the ego's attitudes. And I love this logical next step is when the judgment is ceased, then the mind has only one direction in which it can move. It can't bounce back into ego identification because the ego's been obliterated. It has only one direction it can go. Its direction is automatic. And that direction is into the direction of the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit. So this is the larger framework within the Course of Miracles, and all the details that we talk about are details that hang on this structure. So we'll wrap up here.
It cannot be emphasized too often that correcting perception is merely a temporary expedient. It is necessary only because misperception is a block to knowledge, while accurate perception is a stepping stone towards it. The whole value of right perception lies in the inevitable realization that all perception is unnecessary. This removes the block entirely. You may ask how this is possible as long as you appear to be living in this world. That is a reasonable question. You must be careful, however, that you really understand it. Who is the you who are living in this world? Spirit is immortal, and immortality is a constant state. It is as true now as it ever was or ever will be, because it implies no change at all. It is not a continuum, nor is it understood by being compared to an opposite. Knowledge never involves comparisons. That is its main difference from everything else the mind can grasp.
Mm-hmm. So let's take this in two parts. The first part is we just said in the previous section, wrong-mindedness, right-mindedness, one-mindedness, 1, 2, 3. So it can't be emphasized too often that the move to right-mindedness is merely an intermediate step, a temporary expedient. It's necessary because wrong-mindedness is so insane, so fear-laden, so desperate that it can't possibly access the one-mindedness of creation. And so right-mindedness, which is accurate perception, is a stepping stone towards one-mindedness. And then, as we just said, once judgment is relinquished entirely, the ego is obliterated, and there's but one direction remains left. Perception becomes unnecessary. The block is removed entirely, and so the mind naturally returns home to its original state of total oneness with the Creator. All right, that framework we'll repeat again. After all, it just gave permission. It can't be emphasized too often that this framework is that one of, we're taking the most important step from wrong-mindedness to right-mindedness. Then it goes on to say something that really is off the charts for many people. And we're going to conclude this session with this idea. It really is a mind expander, and one that I invite you to consider beyond this session on your own. Who is you might be careful. Okay. It's a question. As long as you remain in this world, how can you do without perception? You may ask how perception can become unnecessary as long as you appear to be living in this world? It's a reasonable question. How can you do without perception here? Well, be careful that there's a deeper, this is what I love about the Course. Go deeper now. Who is the you that's living in this world? Most people think of it as their body, their brain, perhaps think of it as our soul is living in this world. All that can be brought into question. The truth of it is, you might ask yourself, where is your spirit living? Where is the home, the holy home of your spirit, beyond the body, beyond your thoughts, beyond your self-concepts, into that part of you which God created? I am one self united with my creator self. Where is it at home? Where is it living? We know it says here that spirit is eternal. It's a constant, never changing state that will always remain true without change. It is not a continuum, nor is it understood by being compared to an opposite, because knowledge is not acquired or understood by comparisons, looking for differences. That's its main difference from everything else the mind can grasp. So, part of what I would like to do is point you in the right direction here, not and let you draw your own conclusions. I think that's more helpful, that you use your own decision-making powers to arrive at your own sense of where is your holy home. Who is the you that is living in this world? And the reason why we ask that again is, how could we ever live in this world without perception? And then that assumes that there's our true self is currently living in this world. Much to think about there. Letitia?
That last paragraph, spirit is immortal. Obviously that's answering that last question, who is the you? And I realize that I feel like I own a spirit instead of being a spirit.
Nice. Okay.
And I'm wondering, that sounds like it's a belief of the ego, that I have a spirit and that it's contained in my body, or that I sort of carry it around with me. Instead of being a part of spirit oneness that is outside of myself. Does that make sense?
It does. And it is a sign of progress because, okay, spirit is a part of the team, if you will. Or, I've got this body, this mind, and their spirit, and we're all somehow in this together. That's progress compared to, with the ego would have us ignore spirit, or deny spirit. Um, in terms of the progression in this course, what you're speaking about is the difference between acknowledging spirit in contrast to being identified with spirit. That is a higher level spirit identification, thinking of yourself as being centered in the eternal, in the complete, and in the infinite universal oneness is a very high level of spiritual awareness. It would be part of the one-mindedness state. And so that will come naturally on its own. You can't think yourself there. You can't intellectualize yourself there. Or I used to say you can't grab a pole vault and hurtle over that obstacle. It does have everything to do with what's talked about here. Without judgment, the ego is laid aside, and then, Atisha, the mind has only one direction, can no longer identify with false self-images, and therefore it turns towards spirit and identifies with its eternal self-image. So what you're pointing to is inevitable, but it's a process of getting there. And there are conditions that we just talked about, freeing ourselves from judgment, that have to be removed before that final inevitability occurs. And a big part of that, Atisha, I've often said, is the last judgment ever to be made is the one where we look at ourselves and have no, between the light of Christ and ourselves, we impose no buts, ifs, or excuses. It's a blending of the light in which we see ourselves and the light of Christ. That's identification with the Spirit. And that can only occur as a result of the last judgment that we ever make. We give up judgments of everyone else and of the world, and then our favorite idol, the one we made of ourself, we give up, and with that, there's no more to judgment. So all of that is in the path ahead here. And somehow I have a feeling that what you just said, Atisha, will be found in the next section. Now, I don't know that, but I intuit that that answer will be there. David, you had your hand up.
Can you just expand a little bit more on the concept of the difference between spirit and soul?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, David. Let's see. First of all, I want to step back and just say that within A Course in Miracles, those distinctions are not drawn in a very clear and obvious way. I would call them blurred in terms. So as people read the course, it's likely that they won't find a final clear-cut answer to your question. But I can answer your question because I've had the aid of other materials. So a soul, which is your higher mind, David, is in a process of learning in this world in time, learning to forgive, learning to undo false identification with the ego, and learning its true self. That is a progressive process of growth and change and progress. Spirit, however, is immortal. It's in a constant state with no change at all. It's from eternity. It's part of the universal oneness of one-mindedness. It was created directly by God and therefore is perfect with no change at all, constant state, true now as it was forever. Whereas the soul is your higher, it's the self that Atisha is longing to connect most with. It's the self in time that is still growing, still learning, still changing and progressing and becoming more and more awakened. It's transitioning from not knowing or being totally confused to awakening. So it's an ever-changing time-space phenomenon that has to do with your higher mind. And let me say one more thing. The soul, it exists at the level of the mind. The spirit is on another level. It is a component of the infinite. It is a part of the totality, spirit is. That's why it never has to change. But we know that in the mind arena of choice, it's a very dynamic. There are lessons to be learned, forgiveness to understand, judgments to become free of. The soul operates there on that level of mind. So the goal of the Holy Spirit is to help your soul. Your spirit needs no help. It's perfect.
So it's to help the soul reunite into the spirit?
Yes, sir. Very good. Very good. As a matter of fact, sorry for the hand waving, but you can think of our soul as beginning to spirit up way up here at this lofty state of holy perfection. And the soul is just beginning to waken and realize the truth that the Holy Spirit is its guide and forgiveness is the path. And the soul, as it learns to forgive, it discards its judgments, its attitudes, and its blockages, and rises up ultimately into the level where it becomes a perfect partner with the spirit. But we're talking about the ultimate stage there, to be perfect partner. Long before that, we become free of lots of baggage. Long before the soul becomes a perfect partner with spirit. Anyway,
Thank you.
this is a big topic too. By the way, there's always more to be said, but that was, I think, as good a summary on the short form that we can do. So we are out of time, my friends. That seems so silly to say. How should we say it differently? That's enough for one session. And so I want to thank Atisha for reading. I want to thank you all for your attendance. There's a great and precious promise that we all have a lofty function to fulfill. Viewed from the ego's perspective, it's incredible or not credible from the ego's perspective. But viewed from the Holy Spirit's perspective, it's natural and normal. You were created for this purpose, this lofty function that the Creator had in mind when He created us as perfect spirits. And so towards that end, these sessions are dedicated. Thank you all. Namaste.
Namaste, everybody. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Atisha.
Thank you,
Thank you,
teacher.
Tisha.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
John.
you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Atisha. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Chair John.